Before I tell you what I found behind that locked door, I need you to stay with me. Because what happened the night my neighbor called me changed everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. My name is Daniel. I'm 32 years old. I work as a physical therapist in Columbus, Ohio, which means I spend my days helping people recover from damage that other people or life itself inflicted on their bodies. The irony of that is not lost on me now. I grew up in a small town called Millbrook, about 3 hours southwest of Columbus. Not small enough that everyone knows your name, just small enough that everyone knows your business, and nobody says a word about it. My father raised my older sister, Claire, and me mostly alone after our mother left when I was 6. He worked at a hardware distribution warehouse for 26 years. Same job, same building, same lunch break at 12:15. He was the kind of man who fixed other people's fences before his own. The kind of man who would give you his coat in November and tell you he wasn't cold. Claire is 8 years older than me. By the time I was old enough to understand family dynamics, she had already positioned herself as the responsible one, the capable one, the one my father trusted with everything. She handled his taxes when I was still in high school. She managed his medical appointments when I left for college. She was the one he called first, always. And I told myself, that was fine. She was older. She was there. I was building a life 3 hours away. I should have paid closer attention to what being there actually meant. I started noticing things around the time my father turned 68. Small things. He stopped calling me on Sunday evenings the way he used to. When I called him, the conversations felt short and rehearsed, like he was reading from a script someone had left next to the phone. He would say he was fine, that Claire was helping him with things, that I shouldn't worry. The warmth was still there, but muffled, like a voice coming through a wall. I told myself he was getting older. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself a lot of things that kept me from getting in my car and driving 3 hours to check with my own eyes. My brother-in-law, Marcus, had moved into my father's house about 14 months before everything fell apart. Claire said it was temporary. She said Marcus's contracting business had hit a rough patch and they needed to save money. My father agreed without much visible hesitation, and I accepted that explanation because my father seemed okay with it, and because questioning Claire always felt like starting a fight. I didn't have the energy to finish. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing from Columbus, was that temporary had quietly become permanent, that Marcus had converted the spare room into an office for his business, that Claire had gradually taken over the utilities, the mail, the grocery orders, that my father had handed over his debit card just to make things easier and never gotten it back. I found all of this out in pieces. The first piece came on a Tuesday night in March. My phone rang at 9:47 p.m. I remember because I had just turned off my bedside lamp. The number was one I didn't recognize, a 937 area code, which is Millbrook. I picked up. The voice on the other end was a woman named Vera. She lived next door to my father. She had been his neighbor for 19 years, and she had watched me grow up through that chain link fence. And she said she was sorry to call so late, but she didn't know what else to do. She said she hadn't seen my father outside in 11 days. She said the last time she spoke to him over the fence, he had seemed confused and thin. She said she had knocked on the door twice that week, and Claire had answered both times and told her my father was resting and not to worry. She said the way Claire said it made her worry more, not less. She said, "I don't want to cause trouble, but I thought you should know." I lay there in the dark for about 30 seconds after I hung up. Then I got up, put on clothes, and started driving. It was raining by the time I hit Route 35. Not heavy, just that thin, persistent Ohio rain that coats the windshield and makes the road lights blur into streaks. I had tried calling my father 3 times before I left Columbus. It rang through to voicemail each time. His voicemail message was one he had recorded years ago, his voice younger and looser than I'd heard it recently, and something about that gap made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I tried Claire once. She didn't pick up either. I drove for 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping. My mind was running a loop of reasonable explanations. He lost his phone, the ringer was off, he went to bed early, Vera was overreacting, and underneath that loop was a lower frequency I couldn't tune out. The frequency that said something is wrong. I turned onto my father's street at 12:31 inches the morning. The house was dark except for a light in the back Marcus's office. I would later understand. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment. The rain had stopped. The street was quiet in that specific way that small towns are quiet after midnight, which is completely quiet. I walked up to the front door and knocked. Nothing for almost a full minute. I knocked again, harder. The porch light came on. The door opened about 6 inches, held by the chain. Claire's face appeared in the gap. She was in a robe, and she did not look like she had been sleeping. She said, "Daniel, what are you doing here?" I told her I wanted to see Dad. She said it was the middle of the night. She said he was asleep. She said I should have called first. I told her I had called 3 times. There was a pause. Something moved behind her eyes that I couldn't name yet. Then she said Dad had asked not to be disturbed, that his sleep had been fragile lately, that I could come back in the morning. I stood there on that porch in the damp night air, and I looked at my sister through that 6-inch gap and I said, "Claire, open the door." She said, "Daniel." I said, "Open the door, or I'm calling the police right now from this porch." The chain came off. What I saw when I walked into that house, I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My father was not asleep. He was sitting in his recliner in the living room in the dark, wearing a flannel shirt that hung off his shoulders like it belonged to a larger man. Because it did. Because he had lost somewhere between 25 and 30 pounds since I had last seen him at Thanksgiving. His socks didn't match. There was a glass of water on the side table that looked like it had been sitting there for a long time. He looked up when I came in, and for a half second he didn't recognize me. And then he did, and something crossed his face that I can only describe as relief, mixed with shame. The expression of a man who has needed help for a long time and didn't know how to ask for it. I crossed the room and I crouched down in front of his chair, and I took his hands in mine. His hands were cold. I said, "Hey Dad, I'm here." He said, "Danny," just that, and then he didn't say anything else for a while. Claire was standing in the doorway behind me. She said he'd had a stomach bug. She said he hadn't been eating well. She said she had been managing it and there was nothing to worry about. Her voice had the practiced steadiness of someone delivering a prepared statement. I asked my father directly when he had last eaten a full meal. He thought about it. He said he believed it was Sunday. It was Wednesday. I turned around and looked at my sister. She held my gaze for about 3 seconds and then looked at the floor. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my father until he dozed off in the recliner. Then I moved quietly through the house with my phone flashlight trying to understand what I was looking at. What I found in the kitchen was almost nothing. A half-empty box of crackers, some canned soup, a mostly depleted jar of peanut butter. The refrigerator had condiments and a block of cheese with the corner cut off. For a household of 3 adults, what I found in my father's desk was harder to look at. The desk was in the small room he used to call his study, where he kept his important papers in a locked metal box. The box was open, the lock had been forced, or opened by someone who had the key. Inside were his bank statements, his property deed, his social security documents, and a manila envelope that contained 2 things. A power of attorney document dated 8 months earlier, and a signature that was supposed to be my father's. I photographed everything. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time, reading numbers on bank statements and doing math I didn't want to do. My father's checking account, which had held a comfortable retirement balance, had been reduced over 8 months through a pattern of regular transfers amounts small enough not to trigger automated alerts, consistent enough to be a system. The account had $340 in it. I thought about all the Sunday calls that had gotten shorter. I thought about the way his voice had sounded through that wall. I thought about Vera next door, not wanting to cause trouble. I went back to the living room and sat in the dark until morning. Claire came downstairs at 7. She was dressed, which told me she had not slept either. She had a version of events ready, and she delivered it efficiently. My father had agreed to the power of attorney voluntarily. She was managing his finances because he had been forgetting things. Everything had been done with his knowledge, and for his protection. I asked her to show me one receipt, one record of a conversation with my father, about any of those transfers. One doctor's note confirming he had been assessed for the cognitive decline she was describing. She said I was being accusatory. I said I was asking for documentation. Marcus appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He was a big man, and he filled the doorway, and I think the intention was for that to mean something. He said I needed to calm down. He said I was upsetting my father. My father, at that moment, was awake in his recliner, watching this unfold with an expression that I recognized as the one I had seen in the moments before he used to make a big decision, very still, processing. I looked at my father, and I asked him one question. I asked him if he had known about the transfers. He was quiet for a long time. Claire said his name softly, with a particular downward inflection, the kind that means don't. My father looked at me and he said, "I thought I was signing something about the car insurance." That sentence hit the room like something dropped from a height. Claire said he was confused. She said the document had been explained to him. She said he was misremembering. My father said, very quietly, "I'm not confused, Claire." I left the house at 8 in the morning and drove to the Millbrook Public Library because it opened at 8 and had a notary on staff. I spent 40 minutes on my laptop with the door open, drafting a timeline of the bank transfers against the dates on the power of attorney document. Then I called a friend from college named Thomas, who had gone to law school and was now practicing in Cincinnati. Thomas answered on the second ring. I told him what I had. He was quiet while I talked, and when I finished, he said, "Daniel, what you're describing is elder financial abuse. In Ohio, that's a felony." He told me the first thing to do was contact Adult Protective Services. The second was to get my father seen by a physician immediately and documented. The third was to not let my father out of my sight until there was a legal structure in place protecting him. I went back to the house. What followed was the longest 72 hours of my life. Claire and Marcus did not leave voluntarily. Claire cycled through several positions, denial, then minimization, then aversion of events, where everything she had done was an act of love that I was too ungrateful to recognize. Marcus said almost nothing, which was somehow worse. I slept on my father's couch. I made sure my father ate. I took him to his primary care physician the next morning, who looked at his weight and his pallor and his affect, and immediately flagged him for a formal cognitive assessment, which came back showing no meaningful impairment. My father was sharp, just depleted and frightened. Adult Protective Services opened a case within 48 hours. A caseworker named Denise came to the house, sat with my father privately, and interviewed him without Claire present. My father, alone in a room with a neutral person, told the truth without hesitation. He said he had trusted his daughter to help him and had not understood the extent of what he was signing. He said he had felt embarrassed to call me because he didn't want me to see him as someone who had made a foolish mistake. He said he had been telling himself it would be okay. The APS case triggered a referral to the county prosecutor. The power of attorney document was reviewed by a forensic document examiner who noted irregularities in the signature. The 8 months of systematic transfers totaled just under $60,000. Claire and Marcus were asked to vacate the property while the investigation was ongoing. They left on a Thursday, taking a significant amount of furniture with them, which was noted and documented. I filed a separate civil complaint about the furniture. I stayed in Millbrook for 3 weeks. I slept on that couch and made soup and watched old westerns with my father in the evenings. And slowly, not all at once, but in the incremental way that real things change, I watched him come back to himself. The weight came back in small increments. He started calling people again. He trimmed the hedges in the front yard one Saturday afternoon, and I stood in the driveway, watching him like I was watching something I had almost lost. He didn't talk about Claire much during those weeks. When he did, there was a grief in it that had nothing to do with what she had taken from him financially. It was the grief of someone who had organized a significant portion of their inner life around a story: my daughter takes care of me, my daughter loves me, and had to figure out how to live, now that the story had turned out to be more complicated than that. One evening, we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. It was a cool night but not cold, and the sky had gone that particular shade of dark blue that happens for about 20 minutes before it goes fully dark. My father was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I thought I was being taken care of." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have called you sooner." I said, "You called Vera. Vera called me. That's how it got to me." He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "I need to take her some of those brownies she likes." That was the moment I knew he was going to be okay. The criminal investigation moved through the system over the following months. The prosecutor's office charged Claire with 1 count of exploitation of an elderly person, a third-degree felony in Ohio, and Marcus as a co-conspirator. The power of attorney document was invalidated by the probate court. A full accounting of the transferred funds was ordered as part of the civil proceedings. I won't say the legal process was fast, because it wasn't. I won't say it was clean or simple or emotionally uncomplicated, because it was none of those things. But it moved, and it reached conclusions. Claire was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory repayment of all documented funds, and 200 hours of community service. Marcus received the same terms. A lien was placed on his contracting business to ensure repayment. My father's accounts were restored through the civil judgment, though the process took longer than either of us wanted. There were moments during those months when I felt a complicated anger toward my father, not for what had happened to him, but for the years of telling me not to worry, for the voicemails I hadn't pushed hard enough on, for the distance I had let become a habit. I worked through most of that on my own, and the rest I worked through with a therapist in Columbus, who told me something I have thought about many times since. She said that when someone you love is being harmed, the instinct to protect them can coexist with the grief of realizing you didn't get there sooner. She said those two things don't cancel each other out. They both belong. My father and I talk on Sunday evenings now, not out of obligation, out of desire. He tells me about the hardware store, where he has started volunteering on Saturdays, helping people figure out what they need for home repair projects. He is good at it because he spent 26 years learning what every part does. He tells me Vera brought him tomatoes from her garden. He tells me things are quiet, and I have learned to hear that as good news instead of a warning. I think about the version of myself who lay in the dark after Vera's phone call and spent 30 seconds running through reasonable explanations. I think about how easy it would have been to put the phone down and go back to sleep. I think about my father sitting in that recliner in a shirt that no longer fit him, in the dark, with a glass of water that had been there too long. I got in the car. That is the thing I have to hold on to. When it mattered, I got in the car. If you are watching this, and something feels wrong about a parent or grandparent or anyone you love, a call that gets shorter, a voice that sounds muffled, an explanation that is technically an answer but not really an answer, trust that feeling. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to have proof. You just have to get in the car. My father is not a man who asks for things. He is not a man who says, "I need you" out loud. But that night in March, when I walked into that dark living room and crouched down in front of his chair, he held my hands and he said my name. And in the way that he said it, the whole weight of those months behind it, I heard everything he hadn't known how to ask for. That was enough. That was more than enough.